Hello, welcome to the Wildline Podcast. I'm your host, Dan. This is a podcast about movies and how much money they make at the box office. Today is going to be the weekend review for September 28th through the 30th, which is today. We will walk through the top 10 at the box office with some deeper dives on the wide releases like Night School, Smallfoot, and Hellfest. Maybe I'll mention Little Women, which came in at number 14. We'll talk a little bit about some platform or limited releases that came out that are doing well, and then we'll look at what's going to happen over the next few weeks at the box office. So let's dive right into this. Number one for this weekend, September 28th through the 30th, is Night School, coming in at $28 million. It was released in 3,000 theaters. Its per theater average was $9,300. This is a decent performance for Night School. I think it's pretty good for what the film was. Production budget was only $29 million. I think the expectation here was, in terms of tracking, was mid-20s, somewhere in that range. There was a feeling, and maybe Universal was pushing this, or somebody in PR was pushing this, that it was going to break into the 30s, low 30s, like a 31, 32. That didn't happen here. So there's maybe the slightest little bit of a letdown, but it did perform very well overall. In terms of what people thought about the movie, one of the reasons why it didn't necessarily break out huge was that the Rotten Tomatoes score is a 31%. Now, Rotten Tomatoes score, of course, is critics. They tend to be a little bit overly critical, I would say, about genre films, specifically comedies and horror movies, and we'll see that with Hellfest. They don't really give them any breaks. And if the movie, they deem it to be lowbrow or middlebrow, they're definitely going to give it a really bad score, and that's what they did with Night School. So 31% Rotten Tomatoes from critics, a very low 4.5 out of 10 as the actual score from critics. And there's not a ton of reviews here. There's only 91 reviews, usually with a wide release well into 150, 200 range in terms of number of reviews. Audience score was a 57%. Now, with Rotten Tomatoes, we know that can be hacked, so we can't really take that too seriously. We saw it hacked with Gotti this year. I think it was hacked with Last Jedi by a group of people. So it's not that reliable, but it kind of gives us just sort of a range to look at, a ballpark. So 57% audience score. Sort of in-person survey with people on opening night, cinema score, they gave that an A-. They gave Night School an A-, which is pretty good. So kind of a mixed message here. Critics didn't really like it that much. I'm getting two different messages from the audiences. I take the 57% on Rotten Tomatoes audience score. I don't really trust that at all. I trust cinema score a little bit more because it is in person. It does have that opening night bias. But the fact that somebody's literally there watching them fill out the survey means you can't really hack it all that much. So it is biased, but I think it is good data. And the thing about that too is all of their surveys are opening night and done in the same way. So if you can compare this A- to another A-, it's the same survey and the same sort of experiment, if you will. So that's why it's useful data. So what I'm hearing here is a decent performance from the audience, ripped apart by the critics. I think if critics had liked this more, could have gotten to the $30 million range, and that was like known by Monday or Tuesday this week that it was really good, I think it definitely would have broken into the 30s. I think that the quality here is an issue with critics, which does, you go on Fandango and there's the Rotten Tomatoes score, 31%. If you went on there like Thursday night, like I kind of want to see this movie this weekend, and saw that 31% rotten splatter thing on there, would you go? I think it probably turned away, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. I don't know why they put that on there. I mean, it's such a bad idea from a ticket selling perspective. It makes zero sense. So kind of a little bit of mixed message. I think taking a step back from all that context, I think this is a really good performance. I think it proves that Kevin Hart and Tiffany Haddish are great vehicles or stars for vehicles or movies like this. They can lead movies easily. They can bring out an audience. And I think that they're two totally bankable stars in an era where there's not a lot of bankable stars, especially Haddish. I think she has a magnetism on screen, and you probably saw a little bit of this when she did SNL. She's just a wonderful performer, not only on sort of film, which is totally different than like improv acting live, but she's got that star magnetism. And I expect her to go on to do much bigger things than this and lead a lot more movies. But this sort of is like a notch on her belt that like she can open a movie with Kevin Hart, basically almost at $30 million in one of the slowest months of the year. So I think from that perspective, it's a very good performance. Let's talk a little bit about who went to go see this. Audience breakdowns were on the Deadline recap if you want to check that out more in depth. Over 25-year-old people were 60% of the audience. Under 25 was 40% of the audience. That's actually skewed a little bit towards the younger based on the average movie is 67% over 25. So this was a little bit lower than that, and a little bit more of the under 25 audience. So played well with younger folks. Female was 53%, male was 47%. Usually males in general with just ticket by an audience at a movie is a little bit higher. It's usually 51% male, 49% female. So this over-indexed on the female audience a bit. So younger female audience did really well here. In terms of sort of ethnic racial breakdown of went to go see this, 36% African American. That's pretty high. So tickets sold last year to African Americans overall was 12%. So this is a really big over index here. And I think that's, one of the things about a movie that goes after a specific race or ethnicity, which is, it's very common. It's part of marketing. It's part of what happens. Crazy Rich Asians was a movie meant for Asian Americans and Asian Canadians this year. Like, it's part of the business. And so when you have a movie like this, where it's clearly marketed at African Americans, you have the studio has a choice to make. They can either zero in on that demographic and group of people, play the movie in theaters in areas that have a high preponderance of African Americans, which is a very typical strategy, or you can try and go a little bit wider. And I think that's where you have a movie really break out. Like Tyler Perry's Boo! Medea Halloween is a good example. It was a movie meant for the African American demographic, focused on that, but they played it pretty wide and it did really well. Crazy Rich Asians is another really good example of a movie that was meant for a very specific demographic, but Warner Brothers said, hey, this is a great, fantastic movie. Let's not sort of cut off the rest of the world here and different groups of people. Let's play it to everybody and see how it does. And they made the right call there. So Night School, 36% African American, 27% Caucasian. The average ticket buyer overall for a movie group of people, 55% is Caucasian. So this is way below that. 22% Latino, that falls right in line with the average movie. And 9% Asian, which is actually a little bit higher than normal. So what happened here in terms of demographics, really overplayed on the African American audience, underplayed on the Caucasian white audience, which I think makes sense because it was definitely a movie that was zeroing in on an African American demographic. Where is this going to go? It's a good opening. Especially for September, is a really good opening. It was not a wide open weekend. You had Smallfoot coming out, but that's a totally different group of people that I was focused on. Hellfest was coming out, which wasn't really a factor. And then you have a couple of smaller films. So it did have the adult over 25, over 18 audience zeroed in on here. Basically, it had a total runway to run with that audience. In terms of where is it going to go, I don't know. It doesn't seem like the quality is there to have a great multiplier. So at the base, it's going to do 56, at least a 2x multiplier. I can't see it go below that. It's not going to do a 3x multiplier, I don't think, which would put it at 84. 2.5 on this would be $70 million. I think that it seems okay. I think it's probably going to be more like 60 to 70. I would put this to end at. I think the issue there is just the quality. And there's another factor too. When you go after a specific demographic, it tends to be very front loaded. So that group of people goes out to see the movie the first weekend, maybe the second weekend, and then they just disappear. If it doesn't cross over into different groups of people, then it won't have that word of mouth sort of feedback loop that gets more and more people to go. So, I think that's why it's going to have a low multiplier. But I think overall, it's a good performance. If I have to put it into a baseball metaphor, which I like to do, It's kind of like a sliding double, slide into second for a double. It's not a flop, but it's not a breakout. It's a nice middle of the road performance here for Night School. Coming in at number 2 this weekend was the animated film Smallfoot from Warner Brothers, $23 million. Per theater average was $5,500, way below Night School. That's a huge opening on over 4,000 theaters. So the story in this one is 69% Rotten Tomatoes score, which is okay. For a movie like this, children's film, animated, the expectations you're going to be fresh into like at least 80%. Like that, I feel like that's the expectation now from audiences and critics. Didn't get there. It kind of had that lesser than feeling to it with the trailers and stuff. It's like, okay, this looks cool, but it doesn't really have the polish of like a Coco or something like that. Audiences did like it though. A- cinema score, in-person survey, opening night. I wonder if they do that for children's films. Do they do like the 7:00 showing? Maybe they do. I don't know. That seems kind of weird. If I was pulling a children's film on opening weekend and I had to do like a few showings, I would do like Saturday at like noon. That makes more sense to me. Post-track score, which I believe is also an in-person survey, 4 out of 5. So critics were pretty lukewarm on it. They didn't hate it necessarily, just didn't think it was fantastic. Audiences really enjoyed it, it seemed like. The audience breakdown was 38% children, 24% parents, and 38% general audience. So obviously playing heavily to the small folks. In terms of overall performance, it's okay. Multipliers for children's films are usually pretty high. You're looking at baseline 3-ish. So it should end over $70 million. The quality does seem to be there to have decent legs. I don't know. I had a hard read on this film just because why are you putting out a movie about a Bigfoot? It's not Bigfoot. It's like snowman, abdominal snowman, whatever you call it. Why would you put that out in September when it's not snowing? It's like, why wouldn't you push it to December or maybe even early 2019? It just seems like a really random place to put this movie. They sandwiched it after The House with a Clock and Its Walls, which it's not going to play to super young kids, but it's going to play to younger folks, definitely the under 18 crowd. So it was kind of a tough opening date to come in after that movie. And you could see in the drop with The House with the Clock on Its Walls, it's pretty high for a younger children's film. It's over 50%, which is pretty rare. Usually for a children's film, second weekend, you're looking at like 40%. So I think it shows that there's head-to-head competition between Smallfoot and House. And I think it seemed like a really weird place to open this movie. I just don't really get it all that much. And I think because the quality maybe was not there. Now, like the post-track and the cinema score, that's great. But honestly, like, to be totally frank, I don't trust a lot of opening weekend audiences just because they're hyped to see it. They want to go see it. I'm more like, who sees it on Wednesday this week? And I want to know their thoughts on it, or like next weekend. Because I think they're going to be a little more cold and sober about how good this movie actually is, which I think will be more accurate in determining how well it's going to do over the next few weeks. But we will watch it. I expect to drop next week below 50%. If it's over 50%, not a good sign. But it, just like Night School, it's like a double. It's not a flop at all, but it's certainly not a breakout, but it's definitely right in line with probably what Warner Brothers was expecting for this film. Okay, number 3, we just talked about it. The House with the Clock on Its Walls did $12.5 million, a really high 53% drop for a kids film. Even though it's not really a traditional kids film, you kind of have to lump it in that group. Per theater average in its second weekend was just about $3,500 per theater. Total take so far for The House with the Clock on Its Walls is $44 million. A decent performance overall, I would say. Eli Roth's, best performing film so far, I think. Opened up at 12 last week, 12.5. I'm sorry, opened up at 26 last week, almost 27. This week it does 12.5. That was a pretty high opening based on what people were thinking. But with a drop like that, I don't know. And I can't remember what people really thought about that movie. 66% Rotten Tomatoes. So it wasn't critics' favorite, but it's not like it's not like a 30% or something like that. I expect it to do okay for the next few weeks. I don't think there's a ton of children's films coming out. There's nothing coming out next weekend that's going to really cut it off. Oh, Goosebumps 2 comes out the 12th, though. So it's basically got this weekend, and that's about it. And then it's going to get, I think, cut off by that. So an okay performance. At first, when I saw that opening weekend last weekend, I thought it was going to be a breakout. But with this big drop, I kind of question that now. I don't know if it's going to make a 3x multiplier if it does that. And if it doesn't do the 3x multiplier, then you're talking like that would have put it at 78. I'm seeing more like a low 70s now, maybe even high 60s. Probably like 72. Which I think is whatever. Universal's fine with that. It could have really flopped because it just didn't seem to have that much hype behind it, but it did okay. So that came in at number 3. We'll watch that one, how it plays out. Number 4 was A Simple Favor, another great drop this week. This is one of those movies that like did not have a ton of hype, but it's just been playing really well through word of mouth over the last few weeks. $6.6 million this weekend, 35% drop. It's only lost 29 theaters this weekend. It's in its third weekend. It's sitting at $43 million, which if you asked me about that film going into the fall, I would be like, it's going to have a tough time. I thought it was going to break out a little bit more right when it happened. I thought it was going to be like, like a $20 million opening was possible, I thought. But it didn't happen that way. It's one of those movies that I feel like they just did not market appropriately at all. But when people saw it, they really liked it. And it's a high quality film with 2 big stars, Anna Kendrick, Blake Lively. So it just sort of, and Taylor Swift Snapchatted about it last weekend. So it's one of those like little movies that could, and I feel like it's just going to keep chugging along at these 40%, 35% drops over the next couple of weeks. I don't really see any huge competition for it either. And it's a really unique sort of genre and sort of place at the multiplex right now. It's not going to be replicated by another film. So I think it's going to do pretty well over the next few weeks and have a really nice gradual decline at the box office, which is what they wanted. Okay, so that was number 4 this weekend, A Simple Favor at 6.6 million. Number 5 was The Nun, 5.4 million, 45% drop. Starting to lose theaters, lost about 400 theaters this weekend. Per theater average was $1,600, so it's a drop below that sort of Mendoza drop dead 2,000 per theater range. But once you get below 2,000, theaters start to really drop the movie because it's just not worth keeping it in there. So it's starting on its sort of more rapid decline as it exits the box office here. Total take so far for The Nun, $109 million in its 4th weekend. Remember, this is only shot for $22 million. Now, there was a huge marketing budget behind it, I'll tell you that much. But this is a really good performance overall. I'm interested to see where we're at and the showdown with the other Conjuring movies. If you ever have a chance, Box Office Mojo does a really cool feature where they pick other movies that are aligned with one movie and sort of show you the daily breakdown. In this case, it's all the Conjuring movies that they're comparing to The Nun. And right now, the only movie it's behind is the original Conjuring. It's way ahead from the 2 Annabelle movies and the second Conjuring. I believe it's already passed. Let me see if this is true. It's already passed the domestic gross for The Conjuring 2, so that's a huge win. Annabelle 2 had a very similar gross of $102 million as Conjuring 2. So it's going to go well past that. Is it going to catch The Conjuring? Not going to happen. Not even come close, I don't think. Especially, well, you never know, though, because we're getting closer to Halloween. It was a really interesting release date for The Nun. It's that early September slot that now it has established as a horror movie slot. Labor Day weekend, or I guess it's the weekend after Labor Day weekend, whatever. That's now a horror movie slot just because of how well it did. That'll last probably for the next 3 or 4 years. It too comes out on that weekend next year. I'm sure there's already a movie lined up for 2020 on that weekend. It's interesting because it seems so early for a Halloween play, right? You got 2 months until Halloween, but if a movie can stick it out, it might be able to make a lot of money in October as well, which is very rare. Keep in mind that when a movie opens, it makes 80 to 92% of its total domestic box office in the first 4 weeks. It making a lot in its second or third weekend, that's very rare. So I think that's probably the play there for The Nun. They want to keep it around as long as possible. Maybe it hits the Conjuring number then if it can play all the way through. They can keep it in the theaters all the way through Halloween. That is a possibility, I guess. Another example is like with holiday films. A lot of them get put out like 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, like early November. And Bad Moms Christmas, I think it was an example this last year, Daddy's Home 2. But I think Bad Moms Christmas came out like maybe the first weekend of November or something. It was really strange. But it ended up doing okay because it played all the way through New Year's. And so they just kept it around, and it kept, every weekend it was making a little bit of cash. So maybe that's the play with The Nun. My guess is that Halloween, comes out in 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks? I got to look that up. When does Halloween come out? It comes out the weekend of the 19th. So basically, I guess, 3 weeks? Close. So the moment that Halloween comes out, I feel like The Nun's dead. And I think they probably know that at Warner Brothers and New Line. They're like, okay, well, this did really well. It's going to crush all the way until Halloween comes out. They probably maybe even thought Hellfest, which came in at number 6, might have cut it off, but that's not going to happen. So let's talk about Hellfest. Hellfest was number 6 this weekend, $5 million. Opened up in about 2,300 theaters. Per theater average was a terrible $2,200. So $5 million sounds awful, but the production budget was only $5.5 million. So if anybody shows up, they're probably going to make a profit. The Rotten Tomato score was a 37%. Audience score was a 60%. The real telltale sign this movie's awful is that C cinema score, which is just not good. Now, in general, horror audiences are a little bit more critical on the cinema score, so they tend to be more in the B plus B range, but a C is a red flag. It's a bad movie. Over 25 was 55%, under 25 was 45% for the audience, very much an over index on the under 25 audience, which makes sense. In terms of the breakdown here, 45% white, 30% Latino, so definitely an over index on the Latino audience here, 11% African American, 11% Asian. Those are pretty normal numbers. 2 stars out of 5 on Post Track. So something's weird with the audience score in Rotten Tomatoes, because that doesn't make sense. If you showed me 2 out of 5 stars on Post Track, which is in-person survey, and you showed me a C on Cinema Score, I would be like 40% on Rotten Tomato audience score. That's why you can't trust it, because maybe CBS Films and Lionsgate who put this out, maybe they're paying a PR firm who's paying another group of people to sort of hack that a little bit, and they just call it, they call it asymmetrical PR, which I wouldn't surprise me one bit, because it's been shown to happen before. This is a strange movie. I don't really get it. One of the executive producers from The Walking Dead, what's her name, Gail something, she was a part of this. And if you look at Lionsgate, you look at CBS Films, Lionsgate puts out a lot of movies. None of them do all that well. Nothing opens over 20. Nothing makes over 50. I think the last big movie they had was Wonder last holiday fall season. CBS Films is even weirder. Like, they put out like 2 or 3 films a year, and they never do fantastic at all. And so this is like a joint partnership between the two. The trailer was terrible. It looked super generic. It almost looked like a straight to VOD movie. So this didn't really have a chance. You compare this to The Nun. The Nun has the entire Conjuring series leading up to The Nun on some level. It at least has that built audience who's going to be engaged to a new movie in the series. Hellfest doesn't have that. It's got a stupid name. The concept seems kind of lame to me. The quality was just not there on the trailer at all. This one, it's coming from 2 companies that don't do big films. Like, you think of Lionsgate, and maybe this is because I'm a little bit older, in my mid-30s now. Lionsgate, to me, was always one of those studios that, like, if you saw a trailer, you'd be like, yeah, this is a Lionsgate movie. Because it wasn't as polished as a Disney, Universal, Warner Brothers film or Fox, but it's still getting released in theaters, but it was a little bit higher than like something you would see straight to DVD back in the day. And so they've always had like a little bit of a polished quality problem to their productions. And I think that's just the money that they spend. And I also think it's the in-house style. And so I think it's caught up with them. Like, this movie had 0 play in theaters, $5 million, $2,200 per theater on a wide release is a disaster. And I don't know what they were thinking this. I have no idea how they greenlit it. I think it was it the same director as Happy Death Day? I think that it was. And Happy Death Day I thought was really good. It's interesting though. I think Happy Death Day probably cost maybe even a little bit less, maybe like $5 million. It looked so much better than this movie. So you kind of have to wonder, and that's like the in-house style of Blumhouse and like what Jason Blum does over at Blumhouse Productions. And what Universal, I guess Universal kind of is hands off with them and just distributes their films. This didn't have that Blumhouse polish to it. And it's like they may shoot their movies for $5 million, but they look pretty good. This didn't look good at all. So a lot of issues here. It felt like a cheap cash in for the Halloween season, and it just didn't work out at all. So that was number 6. I expect the multiplier to be like 2, so it's going to make $10 million overall, I think. Number 7 this weekend was Crazy Rich Asians, 4.1 million, 35% drop. Fantastic. In its 7th weekend, it is doing about $1,800 per theater, which is really great. Total take so far for Crazy Rich Asians is $165 million. This is just one of those leggy movies, like I think Simple Favor is going to be. It's just not going to go away anytime soon. And it's once you hit a certain level of word of mouth, that feedback loop kicks in, and it doesn't stop. And it's like different groups of people hear about it and go see. It's a really cool phenomenon to see. We don't see it as much now as we used to in like the 90s, early 2000s, where social media just wasn't really present and people didn't have smartphones. So people would just communicate a little bit differently back then. But now the moment, like The Predator is a good example of a movie that probably got sunk because of social media. It's a bad movie. It comes in number 8 this weekend, 3.7 million, 60% drop in its 3rd weekend. That's terrible. Lost 1,100 theaters in its 3rd weekend. Per theater average was like $1,300, like a total disaster. The quality wasn't there on The Predator, and people knew that Thursday night. If you looked at the reactions Thursday night on the preview showings, people were like, that was the stupidest thing I've ever seen in my life. That's an awful movie. And it kept growing and growing and growing. And then that becomes a feedback loop. So that the social media feedback loop can go either way. With Crazy Rich Asians, it was super positive and good. And that's why it's made $165 million. It only cost $30 million to make. The Predator is the exact opposite. It cost $88 million to make, and it won't even hit $100 million. So, because people hated it and they told everybody on Twitter. That's essentially what it boils down to. So that was number 8. Number 9 was Right Boy Rick. I can never say, I'm never going to say this movie right. White Boy Rick from Studio 8, which is Sony, 2.3 million, 50% drop. Lost 500 theaters. Per theater average was just about $1,200 per theater. Total take so far on White Boy Rick, got it right there, $21.7 million in its 3rd weekend. Production budget was way too high on this, $29 million. Print and advertising wasn't huge, but that was the problem. I think they just did not market this film appropriately. So not a great performance overall for White Boy Rick. Number 10 was Peppermint. That did $1.7 million, a 52% drop. It's lost 600 theaters. It's below the $1,000 per theater mark. So this one is making a quick exit now. Total take so far for Peppermint, $33 million in its 4th weekend. A decent performance, I would say. Not a huge flop. More like they had to like huff it to first base, and the tie goes to the runner there in terms of its performance. So it's not a flop or a strikeout or anything like that, but it didn't really break out at all, and it's just bordering on like a low to middling performance for that film, which I knew was going to happen. It's STX. STX has not had a hit in forever. They've had so many bombs, Mile 22, Happy Time Murders, and on and on and on. I wonder about the financial viability of that studio right now, because they don't really have anything coming out anytime soon that's going to be a huge hit. So we'll see how long STX sticks around. Okay, so that's the top 10. Outside the top 10, you had Fahrenheit 11.9 drop 63% in its 2nd weekend. Per theater average was $652 per theater. Obviously, Briarcliff, it's one of the first movies that ever put out as a distributor, had a contracts in place that you can't pull it until 2 weeks out. It lost 0 theaters after its terrible performance last weekend. I expect it to lose most of its theaters by next weekend when that contract runs up. I would expect it to drop at least 1,200 theaters. Like, it's a total disaster of a performance. Now, probably didn't cost that much to make, but at the same time, I was expecting Fahrenheit 11/9 to really break out just because of the political climate of this country, and it just like did not happen at all, and nobody went to go see it, not even like leftists and liberals. So it is what it is. The Meg sticking around, Searching sticking around. Searching is in its 6th weekend, just dropped below $1,000 per theater, lost a lot of theaters. It's approaching $25 million, so not a terrible performance overall on that one. I really did think it was going to break out a lot more than that. There was a new wide release in the top 15 that we haven't talked about, Little Women from Pinnacle. I believe they're a Christian company, maybe. Only did 750K. Released in 643 theaters. Per theater average on its opening weekend was $1,100. That's terrible. I don't know what the hell this was. I saw it on the release schedule, and I was like, wait a second. Is this like it's not a major studio? What's going on? I guess it's like a Christian remake of the famous book. I don't know anything about it. I don't even want to talk about it besides how terrible its performance was. That's got to be top 100 worst wide release all time, over 500 theaters, I would think. Box Office Mojo is going crazy right now, so I can't really tell, but awful performance for Little Women. A couple of limited releases to talk about here. The Old Man and the Gun, which is supposed to be Robert Redford's last film ever. He says he's going to retire. Opened up on 5 theaters. Did what? $30K per theater, which is not great. That's not really going to go anywhere. It's one of those movies that I think, it's like, it's a platform release. It's meant for New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco, and no one outside of that is really going to do it. They're not going to go see this. Like, it's not going to break out at all. And even in the bigger cities like Chicago or Houston or Miami, I don't even know if it's going to get released there. It doesn't have the staying power for that. Monsters and Men from Neon. It's one of our favorites, newer distributors here on the podcast. I have no idea. I've never heard of this film. Is this, I feel like this is the same director who did Stallion, maybe? I could be making this up completely. Maybe it's about the LA riots. I don't know if I'm right about that at all, so don't quote me on that. A terrible performance. Opened up in 18 theaters, only did $7,000 per theater. That's awful. What's not listed here is that climbing movie, and I forget the name of it, but apparently it did $70K per theater this weekend. In New York and Los Angeles. So hopefully they'll list that soon. We'll talk about that one next week, because I want to watch that one in terms of where it's going to go, because it does, once you break that 50K barrier, even on a small release like that, like 4 screens, then it's something to note if you break that 50K barrier. And then you're 70K and get to 100K. It's like, yeah, like this. That's a really positive sign that it could do well in the rest of the country. Not always, though. There's movies like Steve Jobs, which played amazingly well in New York and Los Angeles, and then when they released it in Omaha, nobody went to go see it. It was just a disaster. It had over 100K per theater in New York and Los Angeles, and then when they tried to go wide, it just fell flat on its face. Okay, so that's limited releases, a little bit of that. I'll try to figure out what the climbing movie is for next week and see how that one does. Let's talk a little bit about what's coming up over the next few weeks. Next weekend's going to be a big one, I think. I'm really excited for next weekend. We have A Star is Born and Venom coming out. Star is Born is going to break out huge. At least I think it is. The Twitter buzz on it and social media buzz is so high. Like, I could not, when the Venice Film Festival was happening, it was like every single tweet was about A Star is Born and how cool Lady Gaga is. Going into the fall, Hollywood Stock Exchange had it at about $24 million openings ballpark. I said, no, this isn't doing anything, because for whatever reason I just didn't pick up on the Lady Gaga part of it. I said it was going to do 17, so I'm an absolute fool. I'm thinking now, my guess is probably like maybe 45-ish, maybe higher. It depends on how big that Lady Gaga audience is. And apparently it's a wonderful film. It's gotten really rave reviews so far. 95% on Rotten Tomatoes. It's cool because it played in all of those. It played at Venice, it played in Toronto. So there's already about 100 reviews, and it's got a 95%, an 8 out of 10. People love the movie. Critics love it. I think it's going to do very, very well. So I expect it to break out massive. Venom's a different story. Venom's just as interesting, but on the opposite side of the coin. Tom Hardy, he's huge. Venom's a big character in the comic book universe. You would expect this thing, if it was like an MCU movie or like a Sony movie, you're expecting this to open well over $50 million. But now I feel like it's going to struggle even to get to that $50 million mark. I feel like it's going to be neck and neck with The Star is Born in like the mid 40s. And the more that I see of it, it looks worse and worse. And there was probably an argument that it could open to $80 million before like the trailer was dropped, or maybe when the trailer dropped, people were like, oh, it's a comic book movie, it's a big character. You know, those movies do like 130, 140 at the drop of a hat opening weekend now on the MCU any MCU movie sort of does those numbers. I was expecting more like maybe 60 when the trailer first dropped, maybe 70, maybe like an Ant-Man 2 number. Now I don't see how it's going to get to 50. I just don't. Unless I'm misreading that audience. The quality just looks so poor on this. It just looks like third rate at best. So I'm probably going to stick with I made a $45 million prediction at the start of the fall for this. I'm going to stick to that and maybe say like 42. I feel like A Star is Born is going to beat it, to be honest with you. There's so much buzz with that film, and there's so little with Venom. I just feel like that they've really switched positions over the last few weeks. So that's next weekend. That's going to be a big one. And then we're really right smack dab in the middle of the fall season, which is exciting. It's a whole different crop of movies, a whole different feel than when you get in summer. Bad Times at El Royale from Fox. That could be a cult classic in the making. Maybe it breaks out. First Man from Universal. That is the Ryan Gosling, Neil Armstrong movie. I think that's going to be massive. Got Goosebumps 2 coming out on the 12th as well. That one sort of like has been diminished in terms of expectation. I don't really buy that. I still think it's got the Goosebumps name. It's from Sony Columbia. I think it's going to do okay. And then after that, you got Halloween coming out on October 19th. Has that weekend to itself as a new wide release opener. So I think that the thing with the Halloween movie is earlier maybe like 2 months ago, I was not sold on its amazing performance that people were claiming. I saw the trailers. The first trailer was not good. There were some pretty significant reactions to the test screenings that I heard about, and people were saying, oh, they had to go reshoot it and do recuts, and then other people on the other side were like, they always do reshoots, and there was this like really shit flinging fight that was going on about this movie. And the last trailer, it clicked for me. I was like, okay, like this is looking good. It's looking sleek. It's looking engaging. It seems like it'd be a fun movie to watch with a crowd of people. It's got this weekend to itself. It's got the Halloween sweet spot here, a week or a couple weeks before Halloween. So I don't know where it's going to do. Like people are saying $50 million opening. Tracking just came out this week. I think it said 40 to 50 in that range, which is really high. I don't know. I'm feeling the hype now. So I think that 50 is doable. There's just also this part of me that's sort of like, I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical of the whole thing. I don't trust the director all that much to put out a great movie, David Gordon Green. And so I don't know. I feel like it could absolutely do 50, 60, but my gut is saying it's not going to get there. My gut is saying like low 40s, maybe even high 30s. But I've been wrong about this stuff before, obviously. So that one's coming on the 19th, and then to close out October, you have Hunter Killer, which I think is going to do quite well. Indivisible, which is a Christian film, I believe, from Pure Flix, and then Johnny English Strikes Again, which is already out on like HD on all the leak sites. So like, I don't know why they're putting that in theaters. Everybody can watch it now. You just go to a certain website, you can find it. Okay, so that is October. Interesting October. The most exciting weekend, I think, is definitely next weekend. A Star is Born and Venom. because if Venom flops really massively and Star is Born really overperform, this is going to be an exciting weekend. And then we'll see how Halloween does on the 19th. I think that could also be a really fun weekend to watch as it comes in. Okay, guys, thanks for listening. This has been the Wildline podcast. I will be back next week.